Hey guys, welcome to the podcast. I'm going to keep this intro really brief. I've been sick as a dog all week, and I'm having trouble not having coughing fits when I talk. So in this episode, I interview a good friend of mine and expert in the field of background investigations, Ken Roybal. We talk all about the Kavanaugh, the circus that was the Kavanaugh confirmation. I thought it was super interesting to pick Ken's brain. He's a super smart guy, and he's very knowledgeable in this subject matter. So I think you're going to like it. Thank you for joining me. Without further ado, here's episode number 23.
This is Things Police See, First-Hand Accounts, with your host, Steve Gold.
Ken, thank you for coming on the show once again, man.
Not a problem. Appreciate the invite.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm glad to have you. I was going to touch on this a little bit last week. I wanted to talk about the background investigation going on with the Kavanaugh appointment, and when something comes to the news that you know about and you know a lot about, it's exciting because you're like, you can kind of call out all the flaws and what they're saying wrong. And I wanted to talk about it a little bit. Then I said, oh wait, a good buddy of mine is an actual expert on backgrounds, so I'm glad you could come on. So we do police backgrounds, which the backgrounds we do, from what I've looked into, they're pretty in depth. The ones that we're doing at work, and they're not that dissimilar to federal background investigations. I have a couple buddies that have been through them when they went up through the ranks for their agencies, and they're very similar actually. They're all pretty much alike. Would you agree with that?
Oh yeah, it doesn't matter really what type of background. Well, I take it back. If it's a law enforcement background, it really doesn't matter what type it is. They're generally the same. The methodology may be a little different, but the outcome and what they're looking for is pretty much the same.
I mean, they're talking to people close to you, family members, spouses, girlfriends, employments, neighbors, things like that.
Yeah. And if anybody hasn't been through, that hasn't been through a police background, it's one of the most stressful things you can do in your entire life. Your whole entire life since you were born is laid out there, and everything is open to investigation. There's no questions that cannot be asked. It's
so true. I mean, I know you've probably had the same feeling when you're going through a candidate's background. It's like you've just been green lighted to, and you have a waiver to just go into this person's life, and you start finding things, and it's like, sorry, dude, this came up, and you kind of have to confront him with it. It can be kind of awkward.
Yeah, it can be embarrassing at times, but it's just the nature of the beast. It's the backgrounds look into absolutely everything, and when I say everything, anything you can think of. If somebody's listening and they're going, I wonder if they, yes.
Right. So you've been in backgrounds how many years?
Total 16 years. I did 4 years in backgrounds as an LAPD officer, and then 12 years as a civilian background investigator for LAPD.
I know you've been asked to consult in different scenarios. I know you've been asked to be an expert witness or something like that in a federal matter. So you are a bona fide expert in this field. You watching this whole circus that's going on, that was going on. He's now confirmed. But what were your thoughts when the background investigations started coming up?
Well, I know that he had already gone through 6 FBI background investigations for various positions in the judiciary, and so I knew they had already done the backgrounds before. And when they were asking for another background investigation, I knew what they were. I knew that the FBI knew what they were talking about or what they were asking for. But what was frustrating was the senators and anybody else that chimed in that has never done a background suddenly became experts on what the background should consist of, and they were, to be quite frank, they were ignorant in what they were saying, and they were wrong.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of them were. I mean, they like to compare it to Clarence Thomas when he got investigated criminally by the FBI, which is a different thing. And he got investigated criminally because he had allegations against him that this person was Anita Jones, was it?
Anita Hill.
Anita Hill. She was a federal employee. The events happened on federal property. It was actually something the FBI could investigate. But don't you feel like that the waters are real muddy for people who aren't in this line of work between background investigation, criminal investigation, state and local authorities? The whole thing was a mess.
Oh yeah, it's just two different animals. I mean, they shouldn't have compared Clarence Thomas to Kavanaugh in the first place. And to say that there was a lot, I have a lot of opinions on this particular scenario, and I mean, I can go into it and what was messed up on it and things like that if you like. Or if you have questions you want to ask, I'm more than willing to answer those too.
No, I'd love to hear your opinions on it because the whole thing was highly politicized. It wasn't your run-of-the-mill job interview. I mean, they held on to information for too long. It could have been private, and they made it public. So yeah, I'd love to hear all your thoughts on that.
Well, the thing is that people have to know first and foremost that the background investigation was already completed. The FBI already did another background investigation, a sixth one, and so when they were asking for these additional witnesses to be interviewed, it then became a supplemental background investigation, which means that it's not a full investigation. And when people get upset that these 40 witnesses weren't interviewed and things like that, here's the way a supplemental works. Now, keep in mind, the first background is exhaustive. It's already been completed. It's sealed up. Now someone's coming along with some additional information that they want to offer. And so what the scope of that investigation is much, much smaller than a full investigation where they would be interviewing everybody. So what happens is whoever is directing the investigation, a lot of times it can come from a supervisor or the investigator themselves, here's something that's hanging out there that we want to check into. So the scope of the investigation, which people are getting really hung up on, the scope is dictated either by the investigators or a supervisor, or someone says, this investigation is completed, but here, check into this. Okay, now you've got this set of interviews that you have to do. And there are 4 or 5 or 6 interviews. I forget how many. And then someone comes up with 36 or 35 more people. That's not going to work, and I'll tell you why. The first thing is there's a group of people that were submitted by Professor Ford that were submitted as corroborating witnesses. Everybody knew they weren't, because if something happens and then after the fact you tell somebody about it, that does not make you a corroborating witness. That makes you a witness to the statement that person made.
Right.
It doesn't make you a witness to the event. So right off the bat, all the people that Ford submitted were not corroborating witnesses. And so when they interviewed them, they had already submitted statements. Ford already did a interview with the or she submitted a letter to the senators, and they did an interview with, I forget who it was, New York Times, something like that, Washington Post, whoever it was. So that whole scenario with her statements was already exhausted, including the statements from the people she submitted as quote-unquote witnesses. So those people aren't really witnesses. They're just saying, she said these things, she was emotional about it, I believe her. Right. That's not corroboration for a background investigation.
And so many, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I say so many times, like when doing a background investigation, I mean, I obviously I've only been doing them for a couple of years, but inevitably you're going to be doing a background where you're going to receive one piece of adverse from a wayward neighbor or an ex-girlfriend or something that could blow someone's spot up, just something wacky. And we can't leave it to one person alone to ruin someone else's life. That's the whole point of cooperation. And it's been like that that's all the way back. If you want to go as far back as Jewish courts in the Old Testament, you had to have 2 or 3 people bear witness to be charged for this reason. And I think people are really getting hung up on that.
Yeah, I mean, if you called me and I was in the middle of a background and you said, and somebody said, I know you're doing Steve Gould's background investigation, and he beat up his dog when he was 10. I'd say, okay, is there anybody else that can tell me the exact same thing? And if you can't provide that to me, it does me no good. I can document it, but we're not gonna submarine a background because one person said something absent of any corroborating information. Because the classic thing for us as background investigators, and I know you know this too, is that the angry ex-spouse,
Right.
We're going through a divorce. This guy is the worst. She's the worst. She did this. He did that. And they're like, this is common. This is a common thread that they're upset at this person. There's no way they're going to get a job. Do you have anybody else that can substantiate what you're saying? More often than not, no. It doesn't do me any good.
I've even had it where an ex-spouse blows someone up and they get back together and calls me back and wants to take it back. So
Yeah.
It's like, the collaboration's a huge part of it. Now, one of people's big complaints through this whole thing was, well, they never even interviewed her. The FBI background investigation never interviewed her. So there's a reason for that. Could you explain to everyone why they wouldn't have done that?
That whole scenario is just full of landmines, and I was surprised, very surprised that her attorney said, "Hey, how about you interview Professor Ford?" Because a really good background investigator is going to during an interview, we're going to ask things that pertain to their statements. And we're also going to look for inconsistencies in the statements. And with a thing like the problem with Ford being interviewed by the FBI, okay, now there's no cameras, there's nobody else in the room. FBI doesn't even record their interviews. There's nobody else in the room that can say, hey, hold on, unless she has her attorneys in there, which would not make it a true interview. They would have to be quiet, because you have to let the investigators do their job, and investigators don't go in there with the thought that I'm going to just destroy this witness. They go in there to find the truth. Background investigators, this is all they do. If you want to define what a background investigator is, they are fact gatherers, with the emphasis on the word fact. Right. All they do is they gather information. I tell people all the time, I'll write down anything you want to say. If it's ridiculous sounding, I'll write it down. I'll submit it to someone else who reviews it. My job is just to gather information, take what you said, put it in a report. Someone else is going to read it. I'll write down anything you want to say. The problem with Ford being interviewed by the FBI is if she gets caught in any conflicting statements, she's setting herself up for a perjury charge, because she's not only submitted a letter to the Senate, she told her story in the media, and she testified with the Judiciary Committee. The more things you say, the more chances you're going to get stuck with a inconsistent statement, a conflicting statement. You get her in front of some FBI guys who have been doing interviews for years, guaranteed, she's going to step over herself. She's going to trip over her statements, and they're going to get her caught with conflicting statements. Not a good idea to interview her.
Yeah, so that for her attorneys, you're right. That is surprising that it could only damage her. So probably you could imagine they kind of threw that out there to try to give credibility to her. But if they came back and said, "Oh, okay, we'll do that," they probably wouldn't have allowed it. They would have come up with some excuse.
No, and they were upset because they didn't interview Kavanaugh either. Kavanaugh, all he has to do is consistently say, "I didn't do it. I wasn't there." He doesn't have to prove anything. He just has to say, "I didn't do it." What's the point of interviewing him?
Yeah, that is the kind of a strange part of the whole story. His them wanting him to kind of go along with his own. They kind of like go, "Why aren't you asking for this investigation?" Like, who would? That's like inviting the cops to search your car for no reason. Like, why would? And plus, he's already had 6 of them. So why would he? Remember, they were just kind of like pointing fingers at him for not inviting the investigation himself, where he's, he's saying he's been falsely accused. So why would you invite that if you're innocent?
Yeah, and the whole thing about that, once they got into the investigation, there were a couple things. One thing was her statements really were put to the side. All of a sudden, the big deal was, let's see if I can get him to confess to blacking out when he was drunk. All of a sudden, it went to the drinking, which is a non-issue because we've already exhausted that. How many people need to them? And prior to that, so many people went on the air and were in the news and they were saying, I knew Brett Kavanaugh when he was in college and boy, he used to drink. Did you ever see him black out? No, but I believe he could have done that. That's not corroboration that
Right.
he perjured himself, saying he never had that happen. Nobody came out to do it. So those statements alone did no good for the background investigators because there was zero corroboration. There could be 40 people who said, I'm pretty sure he could have blacked out. This doesn't help me at all.
Right. And he's supposed to also, they're trying to get him for, he's angry he's clearly angry at Democrats. He's showing his true colors as a Republican. How's he going to sit on the bench? It's like, well, that's a ridiculous statement for a lot of reasons, but there's a room full of Democrats calling him a racist. A rapist. So you could start there. The anger could come from there.
And one of the other things that I want to touch on too is that there's a lot of sympathy for Ford, and nobody's saying that it didn't happen to her. But one thing to consider when you're a background investigator is background investigations a lot of times are very emotional for the people involved, whether it's someone that you're interviewing or the candidate themselves. It can get emotional based on their past history, things that have happened. The last thing we can do is hang our hat on an emotional statement. If somebody's crying in front of us or something or whatever they're doing that's emotional while they're talking to us, we can't say, oh, for sure, true statement. And then you scuttle the background investigation. A candidate doesn't get a job because someone cried. That is, we understand that. That's an emotional thing. But we cannot, as background investigators, become emotionally involved in the cases. And so we can, in our heart of hearts, know, gosh, I know there's probably maybe telling the truth. We can't write it down. The person interviewed cried, became emotional. The background investigator believes this person. No way. That does not go in a background investigation.
So do you think that there was any way that Democrats were going to accept this background investigation once it was ordered?
No, they could have interviewed all 40 people and they would find something else to do with it because guaranteed, here's another something to add on to it so we can make it go full circle on this. Deborah Ramirez's thing where he took his pants down and shoved his penis in her face.
Right.
That whole thing. There were people going, I wanted to be interviewed by the FBI because I was in the same dorm building and I believe Kavanaugh could have done something like that. That's not an interview. That's worthless because, again, there's nobody who witnessed it who would state that these 40 people, the reason they weren't interviewed, to be quite frank, they're totally worthless during the background investigation because all you're doing is you're repeating redundant information. People who weren't there who think he could have done such a thing does no good, especially during a supplemental background investigation. That's worthless. What are you going to keep writing the same thing, just change people's names without any hard evidence that someone can say, I was there? At least they were honest, right? And said, yeah, no, I can't say he did that.
Right. Yeah. This could have just, like you said before, could have just gone on forever if you're going to take all comers. The whole thing, Ken, is so it's sad. It was a sad it was entertaining and sad and angering to watch. And the bottom line too is Kavanaugh has his history as being a judge. And when the nominees came up, was a couple months ago or whatever, I started looking at them and what their histories were, just Googling them a little bit. And, the Democrats could have had a different angle with him. Like he wasn't a lot of Republicans' favorite pick either. Like, and not because of any kind of thing like went on, but because of like Fourth Amendment cases and metadata and allowing GPS tracking to go on subjects without warrants. And there was some legitimate stuff there that was like, he's kind of wishy-washy in the Fourth Amendment. But of course, anything like that based in reality was completely ignored from this whole thing. And we just talked about this event that may or may not have happened 36 years ago.
That's what the focus, because the whole thing was, what I didn't appreciate as a background investigator is that they had already determined that no matter who Trump nominated, they were going to sabotage the nomination process. We already knew that going into the whole thing. So going back to July, his name was already on the list and blah blah blah, or he was already nominated. We already knew that they were going to say, "There's no way we're going to approve this." And as a background investigator, what they did was they tried to use the background investigation as a tool for this sabotage. And when the background investigators or from the FBI said, "No, we did our job. This is standard procedure for a supplemental investigation. We've already done 6 of these. This is a 7th, a supplemental, and there's nothing more we can tell you." Then they got really upset. But from a background investigator's perspective, they did it by the numbers. Nobody can question them, and that's why you haven't heard about it since then.
Yeah, and like you said, maybe they thought the FBI was still in their corner, but after their little partisan mishap that wasn't too long ago with the 2016 campaign, there's no way they were going to not play it by the book.
No, and they were saying that the direction was coming from the president's office and stuff, which the scope of it probably was. But there's nobody. I've never had a chief of police or anybody in any kind of ranking position talk to my supervisor and say, "Okay, this is what we want Ken to look into in this background." What they do is they tell you, "Okay, here are the issues, and you decide how you're going to handle this supplemental background investigation based on your experience." There's nobody from the White House going to tell an FBI background investigative unit how to do their job or what they need to do. They're going to tell them, "Here are the parameters, these issues that we want taken into consideration. Investigate those." But the actual how the background's done and all the particulars of it, if a background investigator goes, "Hey, Deborah Ramirez gave us a name of a solid lead that said he was there, he saw Brett Kavanaugh drunk," they're not going to go, "Sorry, the White House only gave us this authority." Baloney, man.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Ken, in your opinion, was this a complete, thorough, and acceptable background or backgrounds that were done on Kavanaugh?
Oh yeah, absolutely. The supplemental as well as the other backgrounds. I don't think you can investigate Kavanaugh any more than already been done, because basically from his first background that he had to the 6th one that they did for this appointment, all you're doing is you're pretty much almost doing supplemental backgrounds, because you can't redo from when he was born to when he went to college, from when he went to college to when he went to law school, those type of things. You're only picking up where you left off. So they've had their thumb on this guy's background for decades. And
but how thorough was the 0 to 10-year-old background? How much do we really know?
That was the very first background that he did. And so that one was probably the most intensive background that's he'd ever had. Man. So I think it was as thorough as it can get. I don't think you can investigate him any more than they did.
Awesome. Ken, thank you again for coming on the show a second time. And will you come back?
Oh, absolutely. This is fun, and we have a good time. I appreciate that.
Absolutely. All right, brother. I will talk to you soon.
All right, thanks.